it's Olivia. Welcome back to your endocrinology unit. In this unit, we'll be talking about the anterior and the posterior pituitary. So we'll go over the embryology of each. We'll talk about the function of the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. We'll also talk about some associated pathology like gigantism and acromegaly. We'll go through what happens if you have growth hormone deficiency. We'll also talk about what happens if you have too much of a hormone, so hyperprolactinemia. And finally, we will talk about hypopituitarism. In this video, we're going to be specifically focusing on the embryology and the anatomy of the pituitary. So first, I want to direct your attention down here to our image of this fetus here, and there's kind of two main structures that I have outlined for you on this diagram. First, there is our neural tube in blue, and most specifically for our purposes, we're going to be focusing on diencephalon, that part of the forebrain that is going to give rise to our posterior pituitary. And in pink, this is going to be our foregut, and most specifically for this video, we are going to be concerned with that part of the foregut called Rathke's pouch. So Rathke's pouch, an evagination of the foregut, is what's going to give rise to our anterior pituitary. So posterior pituitary diencephalon from our neural tube, anterior pituitary from Rathke's pouch, this part of our foregut. And if you look at our diagram on the right, you can kind of see how our pituitary begins to form. We have this down pouching of our diencephalon that is creating our posterior pituitary, as our Rathke's pouch from our foregut is going to be growing up, and they kind of meet in the middle here. So you can see these structures kind of meeting in the middle here in the second step, and you can also see this pinching right here of Rathke's pouch as parts of Rathke's pouch begin to dissociate from the rest of our foregut, and eventually they will completely dissociate, and there will be this break between the anterior pituitary and the foregut. And you can see that contrary to our anterior pituitary that is completely separate from our Rathke's pouch from our foregut at this point, our posterior pituitary is still going to be attached to its embryological structure, and that is how our posterior pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus, which also arises out of the diencephalon. So you have your hypothalamus up here, then you have this pituitary stalk, which is going to be the connection between the hypothalamus and your pituitary. See this pituitary, both the anterior and the posterior are kind of dangling off of this pituitary stalk, and that is going to be the final form of the pituitary, completely separate from Rathke's pouch, but still attached by the posterior pituitary and the pituitary stalk to the hypothalamus. So because of the two different embryological roots of the anterior and the posterior pituitary, they're going to have different cell types as well. So our anterior pituitary that came from Rathke's pouch and that evagination of the foregut, that is going to contain oral ectoderm. And that should make sense to you, because if you think about pouching out from the foregut that's going to create our entire digestive tract from our mouth to our anus, and of course our pituitary is closer to our mouth, it should make sense to you that our anterior pituitary coming off of Rathke's pouch will be oral ectoderm. These ectodermal cells, often in the third ventricle, are what is going to give rise to the hormone producing cells of the anterior pituitary, so that's a good fact to be aware of. And then finally, our anterior pituitary is also sometimes called the adenohypophysis, and I always like to remember that A for anterior pituitary and A for adenohypophysis, so those two names kind of go together and they do mean the same structure. Next, talking about our posterior pituitary. Our posterior pituitary is that downgrowth of neural ectoderm. So remember, we said that it is coming out of the diencephalon, which is part of the neural tube, which of course is made of neural ectoderm. So we have neural ectoderm in the diencephalon, which will grow downwards and create our posterior pituitary, or the neurohypophysis. Now, why might we call our posterior pituitary the neurohypophysis? Well, I always like to think that it's coming off of this diencephalon, coming off of this brain structure, the neural tube. So it is the one that's going to have more of that neural connection, and that's why we call it the neurohypophysis. Similarly, because it branched off of that neural tube, we are going to have unmyelinated axons that have bodies in the hypothalamus, so a bunch of cell bodies up here in the hypothalamus, if you will, and then their axons, unmyelinated axons, are going to come down through the pituitary stalk, and that is how our hypothalamus is going to communicate with our posterior pituitary here. Now, a quick note about your pituitary stalk. Your pituitary stalk is also called the infundibulum. So you can see it over here on your diagram. I also made an arrow for it over here on my little drawing. And this infundibulum, or pituitary stalk, is going to be incredibly important because it's the physical and the communication connection between our hypothalamus and our pituitary gland. So that's the embryology of the pituitary gland. And now that you understand the embryological origin of a lot of these structures, I think it's a lot easier to understand some of the important anatomical relationships between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So first, let's talk about portal circulation. So portal circulation is going to be how your hypothalamus communicates with your anterior pituitary. Remember how we talked about how our posterior pituitary, because it arose from the diencephalon, the same structure which gives rise to our hypothalamus, kind of has that direct connection with the hypothalamus still. There's neurons from the hypothalamus, they have their cell bodies in the hypothalamus, and then these unmyelinated axons travel through our pituitary stalk, eventually just to release neurotransmitters to the posterior pituitary. It's this kind of direct connection right through the pituitary stalk, easy and done. But the anterior pituitary doesn't have that. And that should make sense to you because the anterior pituitary arose out of Rathke's pouch. It arose out of foregut. So it's not going to have that direct highway to the hypothalamus because it was not a part of the diencephalon or part of the neural tube initially. So there's a little bit of a barrier to communication between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary because we don't have that direct neural connection that the posterior pituitary has. So how do we get around this? Well, if you look over here on this diagram, you can see that there is this capillary plexus that is connecting our hypothalamus and our anterior pituitary. So essentially, there are these arteries that are going to be picking up all of the hormones that are released by the hypothalamus, carrying them down, and then communicating through these capillary beds with the anterior pituitary. So our hypothalamus is going to be releasing these neural peptides or these hormones into our portal circulation. Our blood is going to deliver these neural peptides to the pituitary stalk. We are going to go through the pituitary stalk and then down into the anterior pituitary, and that is how we are going to ensure that we have communication between our hypothalamus and our anterior pituitary, despite the different embryological origins of each of these structures. Now, one final note on the anatomy of our pituitary gland. Our pituitary gland is going to rest in the Sella turcica. And the Sella turcica is kind of this saddle-shaped area of the sphenoid bone. So if you look down here, you can see that we have our pituitary gland kind of nestled in this Sella turcica or Turkish saddle, which is part of the sphenoid bone. And then right above it, we are going to have our optic nerve. And where our optic nerve or cranial nerve 2 crosses, that is called the optic chiasm. And at the optic chiasm, you have both sides of your optic nerve kind of making an X, and that middle part, that place where they make the X, that is the optic chiasm. And because our pituitary sits right beneath the optic chiasm, if it gets too big, like in your image on the right, it can push and squish on your optic nerve. And when it pushes and squishes on your optic nerve directly at the optic chiasm, that is going to create a specific visual deficit called bilateral hemianopia. And bilateral hemianopia is going to present like this. So you're going to lose both halves, both temporal halves of your peripheral vision. So if you ever see on a board style question a description of a patient who has lost both of the outer fields of their peripheral vision, that is a very classic presentation for bilateral hemianopia, and you should immediately be thinking, is there something going on with their pituitary? Is there a mass that is squishing our optic chiasm? And that's why we have this very specific visual deficit. Okay, so let's quickly recap. The main takeaways from this video that I want you guys to remember are that number one, our anterior pituitary is going to derive from Rathke's pouch, which is a part of the foregut, and thus our anterior pituitary is going to be made up of oral ectoderm. Because our anterior pituitary is not going to derive from the diencephalon like our posterior pituitary, it is going to have a different way to communicate with our hypothalamus, and it does so through this capillary plexus or this portal system. Our posterior pituitary, by contrast, is going to arise from the diencephalon. Because it arises from the diencephalon, the same structure that our hypothalamus is going to arise from, it is going to be really easy for these two to communicate through this nervous system where the bodies of these unmyelinated axons are going to live in the hypothalamus, and then the unmyelinated axons are going to go through the pituitary stalk to deliver their contents directly into the posterior pituitary. Remember that our pituitary gland rests in the Sella turcica, so if it gets too big, it can squish on our optic chiasm and create that very specific visual deficit called a bilateral hemianopsia or hemianopia, and that is going to present with loss of peripheral vision and should immediately key you in to think about a pituitary problem. Okay, but how would they ask you about this on a board style question? Well, one way they might ask you about this is they might say something like, a patient presents with amenorrhea, galactorrhea, and bilateral hemianopia. You get a head CT, which is shown on your slide right here. What is the embryological origin of the cells most likely responsible for this patient's pathology? Okay, so they gave you a CT, and whenever I get imaging on a question, I always like to start with the imaging because often that'll give me most, if not all, of the story. And the key thing that sticks out to me on this picture is this mass right here. That definitely looks like it shouldn't be there. And if you look at the location, it's very likely that it could be a pituitary mass. Reading our question further and realizing our patient has bilateral hemianopia, that also seems consistent with a pituitary mass. And then finally, our patient also has amenorrhea and galactorrhea. And if you know, the common pituitary pathology is a prolactinoma, and you know that prolactin can cause amenorrhea and galactorrhea in women, this seems like a slam dunk. This is a question about a prolactinoma. Great, you've identified the pathology. But the question they asked you was actually, what is the embryological origin of the cells most likely responsible for this woman's pathology? Okay, so embryological origin of the cells in a prolactinoma. Well, prolactin is going to be one of the hormones of the anterior pituitary. So we're talking about the anterior pituitary. And because you watched this video, you are going to know that the embryological origin of the cells in the anterior pituitary are going to be oral ectoderm because they are from Rathke's pouch. They are from that foregut, and that is how you would answer this question. Now, I hope you guys are a lot more confident with the embryology and the anatomy of the pituitary gland, and I will see you next time.